Everyone refused her. Only one man had the courage to bond with the two curvy women. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
New Mexico Territory, late summer of 1882. The sky carried a dull haze of dust, and the sun sat hard above the ridges. The trading post was nothing more than a square wooden building with a hitch rail out front and a porch that creaked whenever someone shifted their weight. It was the only place for miles to buy salt, flour, or tobacco, which meant there was always someone leaning against the posts, always a pair of eyes measuring whoever stepped up. That morning the men already gathered, 3 ranch hands killing time until their boss finished bartering inside. The clerk's nephew slouched with a toothpick in his mouth, and an old trapper who seemed to spend more time here than out on the line. Their talk was low, lazy, but it stopped when she walked across the hard ground toward the porch. Her name was Tessa O'Hara, 25, cast out by her kin after a scandal she could not undo. She had been walking for days, sleeping where she could, eating only what she found in ditches and gullies. Her dress was torn from the road, the fabric split low across her chest where the seam had given, the hem shredded so that her thighs showed with each step. Dust coated her bronze-tinted skin. Her long dark hair was tangled and heavy, sticking to her shoulders with sweat. She tried to keep her chin up, but her legs trembled under her weight. The porch went silent because she looked both striking and ruined, and men didn't know which mattered more. She stepped inside. The clerk glanced at her, then back at the ledger. She asked if there was work, scrubbing floors, sweeping, anything. Her voice shook from hunger, but she tried to steady it. He didn't even pretend to consider it. "Nothing for you here," he said flatly. Tessa pressed a hand against the counter. She asked if he could spare bread. "A single loaf." The clerk gave a short laugh, not sharp but cruel enough. Behind her, one of the men muttered that she had nothing left to pay with but shame. Another chuckled. Heat rose in her face, not just from the sun, but from humiliation pressing in on her. She swallowed hard. Leaving meant facing them again on the porch, but staying was worse. Her body shook with the weight of it. She pushed the door open and stepped back into the sunlight. The laughter stopped. A man had moved forward. His name was Harlan Voss, 33, once an army interpreter. He had followed the cavalry across the borderlands, translating between officers, Mexicans, and Apaches. He knew words could be used as tools or weapons, and he carried scars for both. When the war years ended, mistrust lingered. He walked away from the army and settled near the ridges, surviving on odd jobs, maps, and solitude. He had come to the post for salt and flour, nothing more. He avoided people when he could, but now he stood between her and the porch stairs. Harlan was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a scar cutting along his temple. His cavalry coat was folded over his arm, his other hand carrying a sack. He looked at her once, quickly, then draped the coat around her shoulders. The weight hid the torn neckline and gave her enough cover to breathe again. Without speaking, he set the sack down. Inside were rations he had just bought. Hardtack, a wedge of cheese, dried apples, and beans. He offered it with one small push of his hand. Tessa froze. Pride made her want to refuse, but her stomach knotted in pain. The men on the porch watched like it was theater, waiting for her to falter. She felt her face burn with shame and fear, but she also felt something steadier in him. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't leering. He wasn't asking for anything. For a moment, she studied his face, looking for the trap, but he only lifted his chin slightly, directing her toward the road west of the post. No demand, just an opening. Her mind raced. Stay and starve? Crawl back to her kin who didn't want her? Or walk beside a stranger whose silence carried more weight than the town's jeers? She decided in that moment. She nodded once, tight and careful. Then she stepped down from the porch. The eyes on her back burned, but the sound of boots beside her steadied her legs. She pulled the coat closed at her chest and held the sack against her stomach. She still didn't know who he was or why he'd bothered, but she knew the difference between cruelty and decency, and for the first time in weeks, she had been shown the latter. They walked away together, dust lifting around their ankles, the voices on the porch fading behind them. Neither spoke. For her, silence meant safety. For him, silence was all he had ever trusted. The road west of the trading post narrowed into a track cut by wagon wheels long before either of them had set foot there. Dust rose with each step, clinging to their skin, filling the silence between them. Tessa clutched the sack of food close to her body, the coat heavy around her shoulders. Her mind worked fast, still unsure what to think of the man beside her. She had not even asked his name. The townsfolk had whispered about her for so long that every glance felt like judgment, but his had been different. He had not looked at her with pity or hunger, just decision. That unsettled her as much as it calmed her. After a half hour, when the ridge broke open to a dry wash, he finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, a man not used to wasting words. "Cabin's about an hour from here." That was all. He did not explain further. She wanted to ask why he had helped her, but her throat tightened. She decided not to push. Trust was not something she could afford to risk. Not yet. They walked in silence. The only sound the crunch of boots and the rasp of her bare feet against the stones. He slowed his pace without making it obvious, matching her shorter steps. When her breath came ragged, he stopped at a spring seep tucked under a ledge of rock. He bent, cupped water in his hands, and gestured for her to drink. She hesitated before kneeling beside him, but thirst won. The water was cool, cutting through the dryness in her chest. For a moment she closed her eyes, afraid he might stare while she drank, but when she opened them, he had already turned his head away, scanning the ridge above as if keeping watch. She studied him then. His coat had been army issue. She could tell, though it was patched and worn thin. His hands were rough but steady, his movements measured like someone who had lived too long in places where haste got men killed. The scar on his temple drew her eyes, not because it made him frightening, but because it suggested the kind of past that left marks on the body as well as the mind. She wondered why he lived alone. She wondered if anyone ever waited for him. By the time the sun leaned toward the hills, the cabin came into view, a single-room structure of rough timber with a lean-to built against one side, a stack of wood cut and dried under the eaves. It was not large, not polished, but it looked lived in. Smoke drifted faint from a chimney. A mule shifted in the lean-to, ears flicking as they approached. He pushed the door open first, stepping aside for her. Inside, the cabin smelled of ash, coffee grounds, and scrub pine. The floor was swept, the table bare except for a folded map and a tin cup. A narrow bench lined one wall. The stove still carried warmth from an earlier fire. It was not a home dress for guests, but it was not squalid either. "You'll rest here tonight," he said. His tone made it sound less like an offer and more like a fact. She nodded, setting the sack on the table, her hand tightening around the strap of the coat. Her thoughts spun. Why had he bothered? Why her? A man like him could have ignored her at the post, let the porch crowd have their laugh, walked away without cost. She felt both gratitude and unease, the mix pulling her chest tight. She wanted to believe his silence meant safety, but the world had taught her silence often hid worse. He moved to the stove, added kindling, and stirred the embers back to life. The fire caught quick, warming the room. From shelf, he took down 2 tin plates and set them near the hearth. Without ceremony, he opened the sack, cut a slice of cheese, poured beans into a pot with water, and set it on the stove. His routine was precise, almost practiced, like he had done it alone 1,000 times. Tessa stood unsure, then decided to act. She carried the basin near the pump outside, filled it, and brought it back, setting it near the stove. He glanced at her once, gave a short nod, and returned to his work. No words of praise, but no dismissal either. That alone eased something inside her. She was neither mocked nor ignored, just accepted as present. As the beans began to simmer, he finally gave her his name. Harlan Voss. He spoke it evenly, not offering explanation. She hesitated, then said, "Tessa." The sound of her own name in that quiet room felt heavier than usual. They ate in silence, the scrape of spoons against tin the only sound. The food steadied her stomach, and with each bite, the day's humiliation slipped back a little. When she finished, she looked at him again. He did not stare at her torn dress, not once. His eyes stayed on the fire or on his plate. Relief mixed with confusion. She pulled the coat tighter and sat straighter on the bench. She still feared the choice she had made, walking away with him. But as the firelight warmed her face, she knew this was better than the porch laughter. That night, he unrolled a blanket on the floor beside the hearth and stretched out without complaint. She took the bench, curling beneath his spare coat. The room fell quiet except for the crackle of wood and the mule shifting outside. She lay awake longer than she admitted, listening to his steady breathing, wondering what kind of man gave food and shelter without asking for anything in return. And though she still carried fear for the first time in weeks, she did not feel entirely alone. Morning came gray through the small window, the kind of light that softened every edge of the cabin but left nothing hidden. Tessa stirred first, the coat pulled around her shoulders. For a moment she forgot where she was, then the smell of wood smoke and the steady sound of boots against the porch reminded her. Harlan was already outside, splitting kindling. Each strike was sharp, methodical, not hurried, but not wasted. She sat up slowly, smoothing the dress across her legs, and felt a twist in her stomach. Not hunger this time, but uncertainty. The questions from the day before weighed on her. Why had he helped her when no one else did? Why bring her here at all? And what did he expect now? Every man she had known who gave anything always wanted something back. Yet he had slept on the floor, leaving her the bench, not so much as brushing against her. She could not decide if that made him more trustworthy or harder to read. She stood and tested her bare feet on the cool floorboards, pulling the coat tighter around her chest where the torn neckline still sagged. There was water in the basin from the night before. She rinsed her face, scrubbed away the grit clinging to her skin, and twisted her hair into a knot with her fingers. The simple act steadied her. She wanted to feel like herself again, not just some discarded thing. Harlan came back in with an armful of wood. He set it near the stove, glanced once at her, then moved on as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world to have a strange woman standing in his cabin. "Stove needs a feed," he said. His voice carried the same steady tone as before, no sharper, no softer. She bent and fed the fire without waiting for permission. He didn't stop her, didn't correct her, just poured water into a pot and set it to boil. They ate bread and beans left from last night. While they sat, she found herself studying the cabin. It was small, but carefully kept. A table with maps tacked to the wall, a shelf with tins of coffee and tobacco, a bunk narrow and plain against the far side. No sign of a woman, no softness anywhere. Only the mark of a man who lived alone and meant to keep it that way. That made her wonder more about him. Why alone? Why so far from town? After the meal, she tried to speak, the words catching in her throat before they left. Finally, she asked, "Why did you help me yesterday?" Her voice shook slightly, and she hated that it did. He didn't answer right away. He set his tin down, looked at the fire, then at her. "Didn't like what I saw. That was all." He didn't explain further. She waited, but no more words came. He picked up his plate, rinsed it, and hung the rag to dry. It should have frustrated her, but instead she felt something different, something close to relief. He wasn't feeding her with sweet talk or empty promises. His silence wasn't cruel, it was deliberate. She could live with deliberate. Later he pulled out a tin box from the shelf and set on the table. Inside was thread, a needle, and a scrap of cloth. He nodded at her dress. "That seam won't hold long." She froze, heat rising in her face, but then she realized he wasn't looking at her chest, only at the torn fabric. He threaded the needle himself and began sewing, quick small stitches pulling the dress back into shape while she held the cloth steady. His hands were rough but steady, the work neat. When he finished, he set the needle down. "Better." She swallowed hard. "Thank you." The words came out low but firm. He only nodded. By afternoon, he showed her the chores without ceremony. How to pump water, where to stack wood, how to sweep ash from the stove. He didn't ask if she would stay. He acted as if it was already decided. And when she worked, he didn't hover or correct her. That gave her space to move without feeling like a burden. That night, after the day's tasks left them both quiet and tired, she sat across from him in the glow of the fire. For the first time since leaving her kin, She felt the stir of something she hadn't expected. Safety, even if only for a night. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had dulled. And as she pulled the coat tighter and lay down again on the bench, she found herself wondering not if she should leave tomorrow, but what it would be like if she stayed. The days settled into a rhythm, though neither of them called it that out loud. Tessa woke early, usually before Harlan came back from tending the mule, and kept herself busy so she wouldn't feel like a guest with no claim. She swept the cabin floor, fetched water from the pump, and washed the tin plates until they shone dull in the firelight. Harlan didn't praise her, didn't even say much about it, but the fact that he left her to it without comment told her he didn't mind. She learned quickly that his silence wasn't cold. It was a kind of language in itself. That morning she asked for a piece of cloth so she could mend the hem of her dress. He gave her an old cotton sack, frayed but strong enough, and left her at the table with needle and thread while he worked outside. She bent over the fabric, stitching slow and careful. Every tug of the thread steadied her nerves, reminding her that she still had use, still had hands that could make something whole. She caught herself glancing at the door more than once, listening for his return, unsure why it mattered. When he came back in, carrying a bundle of kindling under one arm, she expected him to pass without a word. Instead, he stopped, looked at the hem she had finished, and gave a short nod. Good work. It was 2 words, plain as dust, but they landed heavier than any compliment she had heard in her life. At supper, they ate beans again with a scrap of dried meat he had traded for in town earlier that week. She noticed he always set her plate first, though he didn't make a show of it. While they ate, she found her thoughts running back to the trading post, the way the men had stared, the clerk's laugh, the heat of humiliation in her chest. The questions she hadn't dared ask pressed at her now. "Why don't you stay near town?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Wouldn't it be easier than living out here alone?" Harlan leaned back slightly, chewing slow before answering. "Town's full of mouths," he said at last. "Too many words that don't mean anything." He didn't sound bitter, just certain. She wondered if it was the army that had stripped him of trust or something before that, but didn't press further. He had given her the truth he was willing to share. After the meal, the cabin fell quiet except for the soft hiss of the stove. Tessa sat near the fire, the coat drawn around her shoulders, and Harlan settled across from her, a map spread on the table. His fingers traced ridgelines and riverbeds, the pencil in his hand moving with care. She watched him for a long moment, the scar at his temple catching the firelight. He looked younger when he was focused like that, less guarded. She realized then how little she actually knew about him, and how strange it was that she already felt safer in his cabin than she ever had under her kin's roof. Later, when she rose to lay down on the bench, her foot caught on the uneven floorboard and she stumbled. Harlan was beside her in an instant, one hand steadying her arm. The touch was brief, but it froze her where she stood. She hadn't been held like that in months, careful, not claiming, just firm enough to stop her from falling. She looked up at him, and for a moment his eyes stayed on hers. Then he stepped back, letting go. "Bench is yours," he said quietly, as if nothing had passed. She lay down, pulling the coat over her chest, but sleep didn't come easy. Her heart still beat fast from that small touch. She wondered if he had felt it too, or if he had already pushed it from his mind. She turned to face the wall, trying to still her thoughts, but a single truth settled in her chest. Whatever this was, whatever it might become, she wasn't ready to walk away from it. Not yet. The cabin grew quiet again, but it was a different quiet than before. It was no longer 2 strangers sharing walls. It was something closer, something forming in the spaces between words and gestures. And though nothing was said, she knew he had made his choice when he put his coat around her shoulders at the trading post. The real question now was whether she could trust herself enough to make hers. The next morning brought a sharper wind off the ridge, carrying dust that clung to skin and stung the eyes. Tessa rose early, her body stiff on the bench, but steadier than when she had first walked into the cabin. She found Harlan outside already, tying down bundles of split wood against the lean-to wall. He moved with the same precision as before, deliberate, controlled, but she noticed the faint hitch in his step when he turned. A limp, small but there. She had not seen it in town, or perhaps she had been too overwhelmed then to notice. She stored away in her thoughts another piece of him she did not yet understand. When he came back inside, she set a cup of coffee on the table before he could reach for the pot. He paused, looked at her with that unreadable steadiness, then gave a short nod. No thanks spoken, but the pause was enough. They ate bread and beans again, and as they did, she asked the question that had pressed at her since the first night. Is this your life out here? Alone? Her tone was not mocking, but curious, the kind of question a person asks when they're trying to place themselves in another's world. Harlan sipped his coffee before answering. I get by. Don't need more. His eyes stayed on the fire. She felt the weight of it. This was not a man who lacked company by chance. It was choice, hard-earned. Yet he had let her in. Later, he saddled the mule and told her they would go back to town. Need salt, flour. You'll need shoes. The way he said it made her heart tighten. No man had bought her anything without demanding something back. She almost refused, but the memory of the hot dirt under her feet kept her quiet. The ride was slow, the mule steady but stubborn. She sat behind him, holding to the back of the saddle, the cavalry coat still wrapped around her. Every bump along the trail reminded her of the torn dress beneath and the eyes that had stared at her on the porch. Fear rose with every mile closer to town, but she forced herself not to show it. At the trading post, the porch was crowded again. The same men. Their talk quieted when they saw her ride up with him. Harlan dismounted, tied the mule, and offered her a hand down without hesitation. She felt all the stares burning into her, but she stepped onto the porch anyway, keeping her chin steady. Inside, Harlan asked the clerk for salt, flour, tobacco, and women's shoes, small size. The clerk raised his brows, but said nothing, moving to fetch them. One man near the door muttered something low about easy charity. Harlan turned his head, just enough for the scar to catch the light. His voice was calm, even. That's enough. The man shut his mouth and looked away. The shoes came out stiff, the leather creaking. Harlan set them on the step outside. Try 'em. She hesitated, then sat and slid her feet into them. They pinched, but in a way that promised to soften with wear. Her fingers trembled with the laces until Harlan crouched and tied them for her. The act was simple, practical, yet it burned her throat with an emotion she couldn't name. No one had knelt for her like that before. Not without expectation. She whispered, "Thank you." He stood, straightened his coat, and answered, "You'll walk easier now." That was all. The ride back felt lighter, though the silence between them stayed. Tessa thought about the townsfolk's stares, the clerk's expression, the way Harlan had stood so firm without raising his voice. She realized she had not asked him why he left the army, why he carried maps on his wall, why he had chosen solitude. She wanted to know, but she also feared what the answers might be. Back at the cabin, as evening settled, she set the shoes neatly beside the door. They felt like more than shoes. They felt like a place she could start again, if she dared. Harlan sat by the fire, cleaning his knife, the scar catching the glow of the lamp. She watched him for a long while, wondering not just why he had helped her, but why she now wanted to stay. That night, she lay on the bench again, but when she turned to face the wall, she found her thoughts circling back to the same truth. The laughter at the trading post no longer held the same power over her, because when she had stepped down from that porch today, she had not been alone. The cabin was quiet after their return from town, the only sound the fire snapping in the stove and the mule shifting in the lean-to. Tessa sat at the table, her new shoes tucked neatly by the door. She traced her fingers along the edge of the wood, worn smooth from years of use, and thought about how much had changed in just a few days. She had arrived barefoot, humiliated, carrying nothing but shame. Now she sat in a cabin where no one mocked her, where the silence wasn't cruel, where her name had been spoken without judgment. But with the relief came unease. What was expected of her now? She had to know. She broke the silence first. You could have left me in town. Her voice was steady, but her chest tightened. Why didn't you? Harlan sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, practiced strokes. He looked up only after a long pause. Didn't sit right, he said simply. His eyes met hers for a breath before dropping back to the blade. No more explanation. It left her both frustrated and oddly reassured. She wanted more words, but she was beginning to learn that with him, what was left unsaid mattered just as much. Later, as dusk deepened, she gathered the courage to help more around the place. She asked where the woodpile should be stacked, how the pump worked, what chores she could take on. Harlan showed her, without comment, guiding her to the shed where tools were kept, pointing to the ridge fence that needed mending, showing her how to sweep ash from the stove so it burned cleaner. He gave instructions plain and direct, never talking down to her. She felt clumsy at first, her hands unused to this kind of work, but she forced herself to keep at it. Each small task eased the knot in her chest. She wasn't just taking, she was proving she could hold her place. Inside, when she washed the tin plates, she caught Harlan watching her. Not staring, not judging, just watching. For the first time, she wondered what he saw when he looked at her now, if he still saw the broken woman on the trading post porch, or if he saw someone different. After supper, the silence between them was heavier than usual. Tessa sat near the fire with the coat still wrapped close, her dress mended but still loose at the seams. Harlan sat on the bench opposite, rolling tobacco and paper, his scar catching the light. She felt the question pressing too hard to hold back. "Do you want me to leave?" He looked up sharply, the words cutting through his usual calm. He shook his head once. "No." His voice was firm, without hesitation. "Not unless you want to." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected such a clear answer. For days she had waited for the moment he might claim something in return, but it hadn't come. And now, hearing him say he wanted her there, by choice, not by demand, sent a tremor through her chest. The fire popped, filling the pause between them. She shifted on the bench, nervous but steady, and asked the second question that had weighed on her. "You never had a wife?" Harlan exhaled slow, leaning back. "No." He tapped ash from the rolled cigarette. "Didn't trust myself to keep one safe. Too many things can turn on you out here." He spoke it flat, but she could hear the truth behind it. He hadn't lost someone. He had chosen solitude to avoid it. Tessa's fingers tightened on the coat. She thought about her kin casting her out, about men who had treated her body as if it was the only thing she had to offer. She had lost everything without being asked. He had given up everything because he couldn't trust the world. The difference stung her, but it also drew her closer to him. When she lay down that night, she didn't take the bench. She sat by the fire instead, pulling the coat around her shoulders, too restless to sleep. Harlan moved to the floor nearby, stretching out as he always did. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, she whispered, "I don't want to be alone anymore." Her voice cracked, but the words were steady. Harlan turned his head toward her. His face was calm, unreadable in the dim firelight, but his hand moved, slow, deliberate, until it rested over hers where she clutched the coat. He didn't squeeze, didn't pull, just let the weight of his hand rest there. It was enough. For the first time, she felt the quiet between them change. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was something shared, something chosen. And as she leaned back against the wall, her hand still under his, she realized that whatever this was becoming, it was the first thing in her life that felt steady enough to trust. The night had been long, but steadier than those before. Tessa woke to the smell of coffee and the scrape of Harlan's boots on the porch. The memory of his hand over hers by the fire lingered in her chest. Quiet, careful, but undeniable. For the first time since she had been cast out, she had not felt like a burden or a thing to be bartered. She had felt chosen, if only for that brief moment. She rose from the bench, pulling the coat tighter, and washed her face in the basin. She looked at herself in the small bit of tin hanging by the door. Her skin was sunburnt, her hair tangled, her dress patched unevenly, but her eyes looked clearer than they had in weeks. She was still herself. That mattered. When Harlan came back in, he set a sack of flour on the table and a coil of wire by the door. He poured her coffee without comment, then sat opposite her. The silence was different now. Not heavy, not strained. She wanted to speak, to ask more of him, but part of her feared that pressing too hard might break whatever fragile bond had begun. After breakfast, he led her outside. The fence that ran along the ridge had slumped where a post had rotted. He showed her how to hold the wire taut while he drove a new stake into the earth. She worked with him, hands trembling at first but growing steady. Sweat ran down her temple, dust clung to her palms, and for once she didn't feel weak. When the last staple was hammered in, he looked at her and said, "Good." Just one word, but it filled her chest more than a whole speech could have. As the day passed, they worked side by side, fetching water, stacking wood, tending to the mule. He gave no orders, only showed her how to do things as if she had always been part of the rhythm. And for the first time, she caught herself laughing, a short, surprised sound when the mule shoved her with its nose and nearly knocked her sideways. Harlan glanced at her, the scar along his temple pulling tight as he almost smiled. Almost. That evening, supper was simple. Bread from a new flour, beans simmered with a little salt. They sat across from each other, the fire casting their shadows against the wall. Tessa finally asked the question that had pressed at her since the day before. "Why did you never leave this place? You could have gone anywhere after the army." Harlan leaned back, his hands resting on the table. He thought before he spoke. Saw too much on the trail. Words twisting, people bleeding for nothing. Couldn't carry it anymore. Out here, quiet holds. Quiet doesn't lie. He looked at her then, his eyes steady. "That's why." She nodded slowly. It made sense in a way that stung her, because she too had been broken by talk, gossip, lies, the easy cruelty of kin who didn't want her. For a moment, she felt like they were the same, both living in the wreckage of other people's words. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't cold. It carried weight. She reached across the table, her hand hesitating in the space between them. He didn't move at first, but then he set his hand over hers, the same as he had by the fire. Only this time he didn't let go. Her heart beat fast, but she kept her eyes on him. Slowly, carefully, he rose from his chair and came around the table. He crouched beside her, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. His hand lifted, brushed her cheek, then stopped as if giving her a chance to turn away. She didn't. Their lips met softly, cautious but real. A warmth spread through her chest, not from fear or desperation, but from choice. She leaned into him, her hand rising to his shoulder, feeling the solid weight of him beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. When the kiss broke, they stayed close, foreheads touching. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Neither do I," he answered, steady as ever. "But we'll learn." For the first time since she had been cast out, Tessa believed it. That night, she didn't take the bench. When he laid out the blanket by the fire, she sat down beside him. He hesitated only once, then let her curl against his chest. The fire popped, the wind moved outside, and the world felt far away. For once, she didn't wonder about tomorrow. She only knew she wasn't alone tonight. The morning after felt different. The fire had burned down to ash. The cabin smelled of smoke and coffee grounds, and Tessa woke with her head against Harlan's chest. For a second she froze, startled by the closeness, but then she remembered the night before. The careful way he had touched her face, the way their kiss had lingered without demand. She felt the rise and fall of his breathing and realized he had not shifted away in the night. Her first thought was fear, the habit of expecting a price for tenderness. But his arm rested around her waist, loose, not claiming, and she understood he had meant what he said. They would learn. She rose quietly, pulling the coat around her, and poured water into the basin. She caught her reflection in the tin scrap by the door. Her hair was tangled, her dress still mended but rough, but her eyes looked alive again. She had not seen that in months. She splashed water on her face, fighting back tears she couldn't explain, and then set to making a simple breakfast from what they had left. When Harlan stirred, he didn't speak right away. He stretched, rubbed his temple, and sat up slow. His eyes caught hers, and something softened in his face. "You cook?" he asked, voice low. "Enough to fill a plate," she answered, try to keep her voice steady. They ate together without much talk, but the quiet carried ease instead of strain. When a meal was done, he pulled on his boots and said, "Need to check the east fence. You'll come." It wasn't a command. It sounded more like a promise that she was part of the work now. They walked the ridge trail side by side. She noticed again the slight limp in his stride and finally asked, "Your leg, was it the army?" He nodded once. "Rifle ball. Miss Bone, but left me slow." He didn't sound ashamed, only matter of fact. She wanted to ask more, but the way he tightened his jaw told her not to. Still, his honesty eased something in her. At least now she knew why he moved the way he did. By midday, they had tightened wire and reset another post. Tessa's palms stung from the work, but she didn't complain. Harlan noticed, though. He handed her a strip of cloth to wrap her hand, his fingers brushing hers, and for a moment neither moved. She felt heat rise to her face, but he only said, "Blisters break if you don't cover him." His tone was simple, but his eyes lingered just long enough to tell her he had seen more than her sore hands. On the walk back, the silence turned heavier. She thought about what waited in town, the whispers, the stares. They hadn't spoken of it since the day he bought her shoes, but she knew people would talk. She stopped on the trail, the words pressing too hard to keep inside. "Why don't you care what they say? About me? About us?" Harlan halted a few steps ahead, then turned. His face was steady, unreadable, but his voice carried weight. "I've carried enough lies. Not carrying theirs too." He looked at her, long enough that her stomach tightened, then added, "You're here. That's what matters." The truth of it left her throat tight. For so long, she had been measured only by rumor. Now, for the first time, she was being measured by presence, by the fact that she stayed. That night, when they sat by the fire, she didn't wait for him to reach first. She touched his hand, pulled it toward her, and leaned into him. He turned, eyes searching hers, and she kissed him, soft at first, then firmer when he didn't pull away. His hand moved to her cheek, then to her waist, steady but restrained. He breathed against her lips, his voice low. "You sure?" "Yes." The word came out before she could doubt it. Their mouths met again, slower, deeper. The room seemed to shrink around them. The crackle of fire, the smell of smoke, the warmth of his body against hers. When she pulled back, her chest rose fast, but there was no fear. She whispered, "I don't want to keep looking over my shoulder. I want to stay here, with you." Harlan pressed his forehead to hers. "Then stay." They didn't speak much after that. They sat close, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. The fire burned low, but neither moved to stoke it. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was theirs, bound by a choice neither had spoken in long speeches, but both had already made. And as she closed her eyes, leaning into him, Tessa knew this place, this man, was no longer a refuge for the night. It was the beginning of a life, if she dared to claim it. The following days passed with a steadiness Tessa had never known. Morning meant coffee and the creak of Harlan's boots across the porch. Afternoon meant labor, carrying water, mending fence, splitting wood. And night meant the glow of the stove, 2 plates set on the table, and the quiet weight of his presence beside her. Yet beneath that rhythm, something larger had begun to take hold. It was no longer just shelter. It was life, built piece by piece, shared without words they were both too cautious to speak often. But the memory of the trading post lingered in Tessa's mind. She had not forgotten the looks, the laughter, the way the men had spoken about her, as if she were something already spoiled. And she knew townsfolk did not let go of talk so easily. One evening, as Harlan returned from checking traps near the ridge, she asked the question she had been holding back. "When they talk about me, about what I've been called, doesn't it matter to you?" He set down his pack, wiped dust from his hands, and looked at her without flinching. "I know what I saw. A woman walked out of that post with nothing and still kept her head up. That's what I carry. Not their talk." His voice was firm, no hesitation. She swallowed hard, because it was the answer she had longed for, but hadn't believed she'd ever hear from anyone. That night, she told him the truth of what had driven her out. How her kin had cast her aside after a man's lies ruined her name. How she had begged for them to believe her, but they cared more about whispers than about her word. She expected pity, maybe even anger, but Harlan only listened, jaw tight, eyes steady. When she finished, he said nothing at first. Then he reached for her hand and squeezed it once, hard enough that she felt the weight of his silence. It was not judgment, not pity. It was agreement, an unspoken vow that he would not let her be broken by gossip again. The next Sunday, Harlan told her they were riding to town. She stiffened at the thought, fear crawling in her stomach, but he was calm. Not to trade, he said, to set things right. She didn't understand until they stepped off the mule and walked through the trading post door. The same men were there. The same clerk stood behind the counter. All eyes turned as Harlan asked for the justice of the peace who came through each month. When the justice arrived, Harlan spoke plainly, his voice carrying in the small room. "We're here to be wed. I want it written down proper." The room went quiet. The clerk's face twitched in surprise. One man muttered under his breath, but no one laughed. No one dared. Not with the scar at Harlan's temple catching the light and his voice steady as iron. The justice opened his book, asked their names, their ages, and whether they came of their own choice. "Yes," Tessa said, her hand gripping Harlan's. "Yes," he answered, without hesitation. The words spoken over them were plain, no fancy vows, but they were binding. When the justice closed the ledger, Harlan turned to her, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her in front of every whispering mouth that had once sneered. This time, no one laughed. Some looked away. Some looked ashamed. And Tessa stood taller, her new shoes steady against the boards, the coat still on her shoulders, but now it was hers, not borrowed. They rode back slow, the paper folded in Harlan's coat pocket, the silver ring glinting dull but sure on her finger. She leaned against him on the mule, not from weakness but from choice. The cabin came into view with smoke rising from the chimney, and for the first time, she felt it wasn't just his home. It was theirs. That evening, she set 2 cups of coffee on the table, and he hung his coat beside her shawl on the peg by the door. They ate together, then sat in the firelight as husband and wife. She leaned into him, her hand resting over his heart, and whispered, "I thought I'd lost everything." "You didn't," he said, pressing his lips to her hair. "You found here." The fire burned low, the mule settled in the lean-to, and the wind moved across the ridge. The world outside might still talk, but it no longer had teeth. What mattered was inside those walls. The coat he had once placed on her shoulders, the dress mended with care, the ring on her finger, and the man who had stayed. And when they lay down together that night, there were no questions left, no fear of tomorrow. Only the bond they had chosen, steady and final, the kind that would hold against silence, against gossip, against time. Their story ended not with rescue, but with belonging, 2 cast-offs no longer lost, but bound to home they had built together.